Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today we are going to work on some light pink roses right out of the garden, and they are just in a simple glass vase. We're going to focus today on just trying to control our hues. One of the things that I struggle with the most, so it's just practice for me, is that I tend to go at too much hue too fast. So if I see, oh, that white has a tint of blue, well, I grab a dab of blue and then I stick it on there, and then I'm trying to fight that as I'm painting because I went too blue too fast. And so if you force yourself, and this is, most of my paintings I like to be a little bit more moody, a little bit darker, kind of antique look. However, it's much easier to get dark fast there. Sometimes you might have the opposite problem, but that you're adding too much white and then you're having to fight that. But that's easier to correct. It's harder to get rid of saturation. And so it's better off if you work lighter. So I started with, I washed my panel. I did a wash of a little bit of transparent red oxide, a little bit of yellow ochre, and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and just a lot of Gamsol. And then I took that, painted my whole panel with it, and then I took a paper towel and washed, kind of wiped it down to get to my liking. Sometimes I'll leave it a little bit darker, but in this instance, because I want a light colored background, I wipe most of it off. And so it kind of gives it an antique vibe, and it's not so stark as the white of the panels. Now, I do like the color of some of these panels. They have, they come from Raymar, and I like the panels because sometimes I can cut them to shape. Well, you can cut them to shape anytime, but most of the time I don't need to. But if I do, I can, if I need to cut them. But I also like them because they're really lightweight and they're easy to ship. They're easy to fit into almost any frame. And so it makes a big difference. And I like the tidal weave linen if I'm doing still lives or portraits. I like the tight linen. But if I'm doing landscapes, I like the thicker texture of that linen. So I vary it depending on what on what I'm painting. So so that same mixture of yellow ochre, transparent red oxide, and a little bit of cobalt blue, I did my lining, my drawing. Now, my drawing is just to give me overall look as to where everything is going to sit. I'm not wanting perfection, okay? And that's not my goal. My goal is not perfection. My goal is to get the look I want. And the look I want is very natural. Now, whatever I put in that vase is going to be affected by what's around it. It's a glass little bottle, and so the whole thing about glass is that you can either see through it and see what's in the background, so you're going to be painting a lot of the background into it, and it's reflecting everything around it. So if there's something dark, to the side, if there's a shadow, that shadow is going to be reflected on the opposite side of it. If there's light that's sitting on the top, let's say on the top left-hand corner, it's going to sit on that shoulder of that vase, but then it's going to reflect on the bottom opposite of that vase. And you'll see that later on. Now, right now, I'm not adding too much white, and my paint has quite a bit of Gamsol in it. The pink in here is a my Rose Deep that I use from Old Holland with titanium white, also from Old Holland, and a tiny bit of yellow ochre. And I use that for the center and for where the light is. The part where it has the shadows, I use a little bit of cobalt blue, and where I want it, and that's where the cooler shadows are. But the coolest shadow, where it starts to get dark, then I start to add ultramarine blue, and I add transparent red oxide in there. Transparent red oxide is a little bit darker, so I tend to use that for the dark shadows, whereas in the places like the center, normally the center is not, it's one of the most saturated places of the rose, and so if you want it to go a little bit more orangey, in that instance, it's good to add a raw sienna, and then you get that deeper, or Terra Nova. I think Terra Rosa is the color. That it's a little bit of a brighter red color in there. Names is not my thing. I try to get it right, but please forgive me. So on here, now I'm trying to find first the shadows. So my shadows are going to be those centers or the darkest areas, the centers of the roses. And then opposite of that are going to be my lighter areas. And then in that instance, sometimes I add yellow ochre if it's a little bit closer to the shadows, or a little bit more of cadmium if it's on the bright areas. The widest part of your roses is going to have that bright yellow. Now it's a tiny bit. It is a wild, very loud color. So if you go with a lot of your cadmiums, they are going to be they're very, very loud spoken colors, and so you don't want them to boss you around. So start with a little bit until you know the amount that you need. It's easier to add to it than to try to get rid of that bright yellow once it gets onto to an area that you want to be light. So for most of my greens, I use transparent red oxide, just a tiny bit. Most of my color is going to be yellow ochre or cadmium yellow, and then always that ultramarine blue. However, these leaves are a little bit more on the viridian side, or on the teal side. So we're going to do viridian, and we're going to add a little bit of black and a tiny bit of transparent red oxide. Now, transparent red oxide in green, or in almost any green, it gives you, that complementary mixture. And when you mix two complementary colors, you tone down those colors. So if I have orange and I add just a tiniest bit of blue, it'll kind of make my orange a little bit on the moody or more muted side. And you can do that with any complement. Add its opposite, a tiny bit of its opposite, and it'll tone it down a little bit so it's not so artificial looking. So the same thing goes on here. I add a little bit of transparent red oxide, and it'll mute my color. And the black also helps. If you take viridian and you just add white to it, it will make it a very minty color. So in areas where I want my highlights of my green, then in those instances, that tiny bit of gray helps, or that tiny bit of transparent red oxide helps in not making it so minty. And there might be times that you want that, but keep that in mind, that that's what you're going to get, and you don't get like a light green when you think leaves. But nevertheless, we're not thinking, general leaves. We're thinking about the leaves on this plant and on this particular rose, and they are more on the tealy side. So you might use some of that mint color. I, for one, don't like it. Like I said, I like the more muted colors, and so I add that tiny bit of red and that tiny bit of transparent red oxide and that little bit of black to tone it down a little bit. Now, the thing about video is that it's hard to get those light colors. The nuances of the light colors, it always wants to make it look like, if I put a highlight and it has yellow on it, it's hard to tell that it has any other color other than white in it. But you can see it in person and you can see it in the photographs. But video, sometimes it doesn't translate very well. But so just keep that in mind and play with it. Think about your highlights. Really study the highlights in the items that you are trying to capture and paint. Study them from life, and then you'll pay attention to the different colors of that highlight. It's not just a white highlight. It's not just a black shadow. That's one of the things that I always remember my teacher in high school. I took commercial art at a VOTEC, and she said there's nothing that's true black and there's nothing that's true white when it comes to painting. And if you have that, you have to have it for a purpose, and you have to have it because it's going to call attention to it. So do you want it to call attention to it? And if you do, use it for that. But in nature, we're not going to have that. Our color catches so many different hues within those shadows and even within those highlights. So keep that in mind when you're working on those lightest and darkest colors. Alright, so here in the background, like I said, I'm trying to still keep it light, but I am having to keep in mind that I don't want the background to just scream at you light, stark white. I still want it dark enough to where my roses are going to stand out, but light enough to where it shows a light color palette, a light colored background. So those same colors that I told you at the beginning, those transparent red oxide, that yellow ochre, this time though I'm adding white to it because I don't want it to be so transparenty that you can see that I'm going to be fighting the background, or some areas that are going to be looking like they're lacking color. Also, some of the paintings that they, whenever I was doing, I was studying with a gentleman on doing art restorations. And so one of the things that he said that they would restorers struggle with is whenever there is raw areas of canvas on a painting, that those areas tend to deteriorate much faster. So for that instances, and not that I'm so concerned that I want my paintings to last forever, I want to use the best materials possible, and I want to take care of my process so that they last. But I'm not, my concern is not, my focus is not that, I need my painting to last forever. It's like, no, you want to be responsible about it. You don't want to give your client something that, is going to deteriorate fast. And so if there's stuff that I can avoid like that, like not leaving raw areas of canvas, then I do that. But sometimes I see it in other people's paintings where they leave those raw areas, especially if they use like that kind of burnty reds in the background and it shows through and it just looks so bright and beautiful. I think it's important, for that artist to have that look, and so I can understand that way too. So, but it's just food for thought. So just keep that in mind. If it's something important to you, then cover it up. And if it's more important to you to have that richness of that background, then that's what you got to do. And that's what it's about, is figuring out, making those choices. But the more knowledge you have, the better you are at making choices. That more information that you have. So now I'm trying to figure out where my shadows are, and the shadows on here have that pink, that a little bit of rose, and more cobalt blue for my shadows, because I want them to look a little bit on the cool side. Now that I have everything where I want it, I have the rose placement where I want, and I have my darkest areas, my lightest areas all figured out. Most of my shadows are in place at this point. Now I start really shaping my objects. So now that I'm working on the background, I use that same background to cut away and to find out where these shapes are going to be that I'm looking for. And I'm still keeping in mind that I'm keeping it light. If I try to make too many corrections, usually with darker paints, I just paint over it. I just add more paint on top of that. However, when you're going light, especially if you're dealing with oil paints where your paint is not dry, as if you're going on with acrylics. With oil paints, you'll just those colors will keep blending together, or sometimes they'll soak up some of that background color. So in this instance, if I make mistakes, I take a paper towel and wipe some of it off, or try to cut some of it, some of those shapes. So if my rosebud is a little bit too big, then I'll just take that paper towel and wipe off a little bit of that area that I don't want in there, to kind of give it its better shape, versus just taking paint and adding to it. And you'll notice that a lot of oil painting is pushing the paint around versus layering that paint. So if I want that dark color moved a little bit, then I just move it with my brush rather than paint over the part that I don't want to be dark. So you gotta be pushy on here, and you gotta, pretend like you're the boss, even if you don't feel like it. And you'll get it. But you do have to, you'll notice you're pushing paint versus acrylics, where you're just layering the paints. And as I mentioned before, it's a lot of back and forth when you are doing oil paint. So you'll work on certain aspects of the painting and then you'll come back to it later on. So now that I have my overall shape, I have, everything, like I said, in its place, but you've cut away, you've detailed a little bit more of your edges. Now you can start adding, trying to find the layers within the roses. So before I just had one big blob of dark area and one big blob of white area or lighter area. So now I'm looking within those areas and trying to find the layers of petals. Now I'm not going to do all the petals, and I'm also paying attention to how light I want on each side. So for example, on my shadows, if you go in there and you put a stark white on those shadows, like, oh, but that looks much lighter than everything else, it's going to look like stark white. So what you do is you take that color that was already there, but you add just a tiny bit of white. And then you'll see that it makes a big difference. The same thing goes with your lightest areas. If you are working on your light area and you want a tiny bit of shadow, you're not going to go in there with your darkest color to put in that shadow. Just that tiniest bit of color will make a big difference when it comes to your lightest areas. And this is the one, like I said, I know this, it makes total sense, but whenever I'm doing, what do? I grab a whole bunch of pink and a whole bunch of ultramarine blue, and I'm like, that's what it needs. And it's like, nope, we are, got to work on control. So you'll see that your darkest darks means one thing when you're dealing with your lights, and then it means another thing when you're dealing with your dark areas. The issue with doing painting videos is that it's so, I feel like the process is very repetitive. It's a lot of, even though your subject changes, the same process is what's going to get you there, because you're not thinking about I'm painting roses. You're thinking about I'm painting this shape and it's in this hue or this value. And so once you stop thinking about, okay, you're not painting roses, you're painting these odd shapes that are layers and that kind of curve and have different textures in them, then that is going to, sometimes seem repetitive. So if you give yourself different things to work on each time, then it helps the monotonous of it. Especially if you do it day in and day out. You need something to kind of challenge you and help you grow and help you stay focused. So when people are looking at a work of art, particularly it's the same thing. If you're looking at a portrait, the first thing that you're going to see is that person. You're not going to pay, that much attention to the chair they're sitting on. Like, that's all going to be secondary. The background, all that's going to be secondary. When it comes to a still life, you're paying attention to what it is that you want people to focus on. And so if it's a vase and you really love that vase, you're not going to want, like very crazy, elaborate, or bright colored arrangement sitting on top of it, because then it's going to detract from your vase. In this instance, I like the light hues of these roses, and because of that, I picked a vase that is not going to detract from that. So it's not something that I am paying close attention in detail. I don't want it very particularly, in focus. I also don't want too much contrast in there. I don't want too many hues. And so just keep it nice and simple so that your roses are what stand out. And it's the thing that I want to focus on this time, that I feel like I need to work on and grow on. And so I'm keeping that in mind. Now, the things that you want focus on are going to be more detailed, not necessarily super detailed, like, there's some, anyways, there's some artists that do super detail for the whole thing, and I admire it, I love it, but I don't like it in my work. In my work, I like the play between those things that are detailed and those things that are not. And I think it gives it interest, but it makes it fun for me. So now that I'm painting, that I'm keeping that in mind, that where my focus is, now I'm working on the little bottle that it's sitting in. And I'm keeping in mind that I'm using the same colors that I'm using throughout. So the same colors I use for the shadows, the same colors I use for my background is what's going to be in my bottle, because that bottle is reflecting all those things. The same greens that I use for my leaves is what's showing up on the inside of this bottle, but it does have a little bit more gray, because some of those colors, because of the water or because of the glass, those kind of colors bounce around inside that bottle, And so you won't see things in detail. Unless things are really close to the glass, like touching the glass, you will not see, there'll be blurry edges. And you'll notice that, particularly if they are underwater. It'll blur out your edges a lot. So if you're painting glass, that's one of the things that you'll pay attention to is that you don't want a lot of sharp edges within your glass. So I'll work on this just a little bit more today, but I'll come back to it in a day or two once, like I said, I like to work on it whenever my paint is a little bit tacky, so the oil paint stays in place a little bit more. But I will, like I said, come back to it. I appreciate you watching. I hope that you enjoy it, that you get a little, learn something, or, that it's just inspirational to you. I appreciate if you subscribe to the channel, share with those that you think might enjoy it as well, so that I get to make more videos like this for you. So thank you, and like I said, enjoy the rest of it. Have a wonderful day and enjoy painting.